name is Jesse Morton, which of course is just a general all-American name. But for about a decade of my life, I went by the kunya, in Arabic we say, or the nom de jour, Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. I converted to Islam and became at one point a premier sort of radical who was calling to the path of Salafi jihadist ideology in the era when Al-Qaeda was the number one threat, the number one extremist threat, and when we were transitioning into the early years of trying to understand extremism in lieu of the war on terror. But my journey starts, and in many ways treks well with what we've learned about the field of trying to understand why people radicalize into violence and its extremist ideologies, with a whole lot of background that was trauma. And a large portion of my story is really my traumatic projections of internal pain, frustration, anguish, and being detached from my own self that started early in life and was a process of discovery that ended up in a very negative place. So I was abused as a child so significantly, and we're starting to see serious correlations between the prevalency of adverse childhood experiences and the susceptibility that that leads to, not just radicalization. I don't have enough data about that, but we can assume as well that we might want to explore that rabbit hole because we see it with addiction, we see it with incarceration, we see it with criminal behavior. And in fact, that was my trajectory. So I was abused at 15 years old. I run away and I'm looking for an identity like anybody who's 15, but I'm doing so on the street, out back of Port Authority on 42nd Street in Manhattan, where I'm staying in a drop-in center, trying to figure things out, trying to migrate through an urban world I had theretofore not known about and find myself at the same time, plus heal from trauma. And I was basically just disassociating and detached and drifting. I would have clung on to anything that gave me any sense of stability. And the first thing that I clung on to was leftist Grateful Dead hippiedom, if you will. So the Grateful Dead is, of course, a countercultural movement attached to the 1960s and has a very, let yourself drift is a good thing. Structure is not necessarily a good thing. And I would travel around to concert parking lots, and in some ways it was a religion. And I started to sell drugs and access concert goers going to parties inside of concerts. I started to experiment with hallucinogenics, but migrated to narcotics. And for several years lived on the streets and tried to find myself in that way. I was incarcerated, of course, as a consequence of that criminal behavior for the first time. And I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And it kind of settled inside of me that this is an archetype. This is a narrative that I want to emulate. This is an individual who is traumatized, who experienced his own persecutions, misunderstandings, this intelligent individual, and capable of reorienting his own negativity in a positive direction. And it piqued my interest in Islam. And so I drifted around for another couple of years, exploring religion and spirituality, continued to navigate into addiction. And as the addiction got worse, found myself incarcerated again and recruited in Richmond City Jail by a veteran of the Afghan Soviets jihad. He was a Moroccan who was then a citizen. He left Afghanistan after the war was over, went back to Morocco, ended up working here, and was incarcerated for physical assault charges. And he kind of recruited me, but at the same time, he gave me the stability of Islam, 5 prayers a day, fasting for the month of Ramadan, and giving me structure. He was grooming me in a sense, because he told me one day, now that you know how to pray in Arabic, go wash in the shower. And when you come back, you'll be completely cleansed of all of your previous sins and misgivings, because now you can become a real Muslim. And I converted to Islam, and he told me, and now I give you your Islamic name, Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. Yunus is Jonah, in the Bible, the prophet that ran from God, but when swallowed in the belly of the beast, which he used as representative of the jail cell that I was in. And that when he was spit back up on shore, went and preached to his people, and all of his people became upon the truth. And Abdullah, meaning you're a slave of Allah, you'll never be anything. You're just a human being. You're nothing but dust, but you must call. And then Muhammad, so the best person that you need to emulate. And it really gave me an identity that I could kill the person that I hated, which was Jesse Morton, and become this Yunus Abdullah Muhammad embodied on the archetype of Malcolm X, projecting all the rage and anger and the frustration onto my society. And then one day there was an altercation with a Christian, and he showed me a narration of the Prophet Muhammad where it's narrated in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, books of hadith from the Muslims, that if a person comes and stands in front of your prayer, gently move them with your right hand to get them out of the way. But if they do not move, then stand up and fight them, for verily they are a devil. This is how it translates. And that's kind of what happened. And he used that event and that physical altercation to like desensitize me from violence and to tell me about an impending war that would go on until the end of times. So that prophetic piece that we see influencing and conspiracy theory, of Jewish control, that we see creeping into the far right, and all this came in and basically set me out after that into a world where I changed my life rapidly, got away from addiction, migrated, and the rest of the story is long and we don't need to talk about it because it basically ends with me. After September the 11th happened, George Bush said, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." And I never could connect to American society. I never felt like I belonged, and I felt like they failed to protect me. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to see what the terrorists have to say, and continued to explore that cognitively and utilized a good ability of articulation and a good ability to think through things with radical complexity, and projected that anger and hatred in ways that it never had been done before. My organization was called Revolution Muslim. It combined anti-imperialist ideology with Salafi jihadist and Islamist sentiments, sent a message that resonated with Westerners. Looked like it was sort of on Hollywood or Madison Avenue, if you will. So I designed the English language jihadi magazines that were started here in America and then became Inspire magazine when my colleagues traveled to join Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so I was active in the era that preceded ISIS, but in so many ways, the structures and the ecosystems that we set up online and the strategies and the tactics and adaptations that we had to utilize in order to continuously play that cat and mouse game with a world that was trying to understand us and governmental and law enforcement agencies that were trying to thwart our efforts became something that preoccupied my life for a long time. I threatened the writers of South Park for portraying the Prophet Muhammad in cartoons in 2010 and had to run to Morocco. And it's there that I started a process of transformation because while I was awaiting the US government to issue criminal charges and trying to figure out what to do, I was able to interact with millennial Arab youth in the midst of the Arab Spring when there was this groundswell and massive consciousness surrounding the question of what Arab democratic future would look like. And there was a really big belief in the freedom and the liberation of these individuals away from these tyrannical authoritarian regimes that also jihadists wanted to achieve. And that was our objective, as far as like taking down the far enemy that was the United States. So that the ultimate objective is not to destroy America, it's to destroy America so that you can liberate the people. And then you see the people liberating themselves, and you're a totalitarian that comes from a democracy and a democratic identity. And now you're amidst people and all they really want is the right to express themselves and to read free press, and you're living in the society. And it started to plant a seed of change. But it was that context that was really helpful to get me to think about the difference between being radical, okay, maybe violent nonviolence. There's maybe two different types of radicalization. And I started a long process, ultimately was arrested, met a former jihadist cleric in Moroccan jail for 5 months, was sort of my first contact with a former extremist, realized there was possibilities of life after hate, flown back to the United States, spent 3 years and 8 months in jail, some of it, over a year of it in solitary confinement, but continued to reform myself. And ever since they've let me out in March of 2015, I have tried to do the best I can to heal myself and work toward healing others. And now I run an organization called Parallel Networks that does an array of different things and concentrates on international projects a lot, but we also run a domestic ecosystemic approach to combating polarization, hate, and extremism that's based upon some pretty innovative ideas, an entire philosophy, and it's basically utilizing evidence-based processes, but also recognizing the limitations of empiricism and the value of experiential knowledge in order to understand how the inner workings and the complexities associated with radicalization that cannot be captured in models or simplistic coding or in any of the techniques that the academics use, and then utilizing the creativity that once drove an extremist and utilizing the skill set that I established then and the networking skills and all of that. And really, I'm basically reorienting previously antisocial radicalization and trying on my own journey, on my own quest to see if I can get healthy, sort of through, realizing who I am by making amends for what I once caused and developed.